The unforgiving Arizona sun beat down on Maxwell Cooper's weathered face as he dismounted his chestnut mare. At 53, the lines etched around his eyes told stories of hardship and survival in the untamed West. 20 years as a cavalry scout had taught him to read landscapes like most men read books. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for the gamble he was about to take. The abandoned silver mine before him, Little Rattler, they called it, stood like a gaping wound in the mountainside, its timbers grayed and warped from years of neglect. Max wiped sweat from his brow with a bandana that had once been red but was now faded to the color of dried clay. $1, he muttered to himself, still hardly believing the transaction he'd completed at the county office in Tucson just yesterday. Either the bargain of a lifetime or the final folly of an old fool. Behind him stretched miles of desert scrubland, punctuated by saguaro cacti, standing like silent sentinels against the cloudless blue sky. The nearest town, Silver Springs, was 15 miles east, little more than a collection of weatherboard buildings, a general store, 2 saloons, and a population that had dwindled since the mine's closure 5 years ago. Max had passed through countless towns like it during his years scouting for the army, watching them boom with the discovery of precious metals and then wither when the veins ran dry. He'd sworn he would never be seduced by mining fever, yet here he stood, proprietor of a played-out hole in the ground that had bankrupted the previous owner. The mine had been auctioned for back taxes, and Max had been the only bidder. Sheriff Willis had laughed when he'd placed his dollar on the counter. "You're buying nothing but trouble, Cooper," he'd warned, but Max had seen something in the survey maps that others had missed, or perhaps it was just the desperate hope of a man with nowhere else to go. The war had ended decades ago, but for Max, the memories remained as fresh as yesterday. The screams of men and horses, the acrid smell of gunpowder, and the weight of responsibility for the lives under his command. After mustering out, he drifted through the territories, working as a guide, a ranch hand, and occasionally as a deputy when towns needed someone who could handle a gun. But age had begun to catch up with him, and the prospect of dying broke and alone in some nameless settlement had driven him to seek something more permanent. The Little Rattler represented his last chance at independence, a desperate roll of the dice for a man who had always lived by his wits. Max led his horse toward the ramshackle cabin that stood 50 yards from the mine entrance, its door hanging askew on rusted hinges. This would be home now, for better or worse. Inside the cabin, dust motes danced in the shafts of light that penetrated through gaps in the roof. A crude wooden table, 2 chairs, an iron stove, and a rope bed with a mouldering mattress constituted the entirety of the furnishings. Max's eyes were drawn to a faded photograph nailed to the wall, a group of miners standing proudly before the entrance to the Little Rattler, their faces streaked with dirt, but beaming with the confidence of men who believed fortune smiled upon them. That had been in '82, according to the county records, when the first substantial silver strike had transformed this remote hillside into a hub of activity. For 3 years, the mine had produced steadily, then abruptly declined. The previous owner, a man named Harlan Wilkes, had invested heavily in new equipment just before the vein ran dry, driving himself into insurmountable debt. Local legend said he had shot himself right where Max now stood, though the records diplomatically listed his death as misadventure. "Well, Wilkes," Max said to the empty room, "let's see if you left anything worth dying for." He unrolled the yellowed survey maps he had purchased from the widow of a former assayer in Tucson. Most prospectors focused on the main shaft, which had been thoroughly worked over, but Max's experienced eye had spotted an anomaly in the southwestern section, a fault line that the original surveyors had noted but apparently never explored. In his years as a scout, Max had developed a keen sense for reading natural formations, and something about that fault line nagged at him. It was a long shot, but long shots were all he had left. He would need supplies, equipment, and at least a week of hard work before he could even begin to test his theory. Max stepped back outside, squinting against the harsh light. The sun was beginning its westward descent, casting long shadows across the barren landscape. He would ride into Silver Springs tomorrow for supplies, but tonight he would sleep under the stars, as he had done countless times before. The next morning found Max tethering his mare outside Donovan's general store in Silver Springs. The town was quieter than he remembered from his last visit 2 years ago. Several storefronts stood empty, their windows boarded up, casualties of the mine's closure and the exodus that followed. A few locals lounged on the boardwalk, regarding the newcomer with undisguised curiosity. News traveled fast in small towns, and Max suspected his purchase of the little rattler was already common knowledge. He nodded politely to the onlookers, but offered no conversation as he pushed through the door into the store. Inside, shelves lined the walls, stocked with the necessities of frontier life: canned goods, ammunition, tools, clothing, and the small luxuries that made existence in this harsh land bearable. Behind the counter stood a heavy-set man with mutton-chop whiskers and suspicious eyes. "You'd be Cooper," the man said without preamble. "Heard you bought yourself a heap of trouble up at Little Rattler." "News travels fast," Max replied dryly, removing his hat as he approached the counter. "Maxwell Cooper. And you'd be Donovan, I take it?" The storekeeper nodded, his expression unreadable as he wiped his hands on his apron. "What can I do for you, Mr. Cooper?" There was something in his tone, not quite hostility, but a wariness that Max had encountered before in frontier towns. Outsiders were always suspect until they proved themselves, especially those foolish enough to chase dreams of easy riches. Max produced a list he had prepared the night before. "I'll need these supplies, planning to reopen part of the mine." Donovan's eyebrows rose as he scanned the list. "Blasting powder? Steel picks? You're serious about this fool's errand?" It wasn't a question. Max met the storekeeper's gaze steadily. "I don't expect to strike it rich, if that's what you're thinking. Just looking to make a modest living." This wasn't entirely true, but Max had learned long ago that sharing too much of one's plans was seldom wise. Donovan snorted, but began gathering the items on the list. "Wilkes said the same thing, right before he blew his brains out. That mine's cursed, Mr. Cooper, not just because it's played out, neither." He lowered his voice, glancing toward the door as if afraid of being overheard. "Apaches don't go near that mountain. Say it's sacred ground, haunted." Max had heard such talk before, superstitions attached to landmarks throughout the territories. Often they were nothing more than stories meant to scare off settlers from lands that indigenous peoples considered their own. "I've dealt with Apaches before," he said simply. "I respect their ways, but I've got a deed that says that mine is mine." Donovan shrugged as he added a sack of coffee beans to Max's growing pile of supplies. "Your funeral. Just don't come crying when strange things start happening up there." Wilkes complained about voices in the deep shaft, said he'd see lights moving in the mine at night when nobody was inside. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another customer, a tall man in a black frock coat with a silver star pinned to his vest. The sheriff nodded to Donovan before turning his attention to Max. "Mr. Cooper, Sheriff Thomas Blackwood. Understand you've taken possession of the Little Rattler." His handshake was firm, his eyes evaluating. Max had met many lawmen over the years and recognized the type: cautious, observant, not quick to judgment, but always alert for trouble. "That's right, Sheriff. Just picking up some supplies before I head back up there." Blackwood nodded, seemingly satisfied with what he saw. "Word of advice, Cooper. That area's seen some Apache activity lately. Nothing serious, just hunting parties passing through, but they're particular about that mountain. There's an old medicine man, Nakohi, who comes around these parts, claims the mountain holds something sacred to his people. Might be worth talking to him if you run into problems." Max thanked the sheriff for the advice, paid Donovan for his supplies, and arranged to have them delivered to the mine the following day. As he stepped back onto the boardwalk, he became aware of being watched. Across the street, an elderly Native American man sat motionless in the shade of an awning, his dark eyes fixed on Max with unnerving intensity. The man's face was deeply lined, his long grey hair bound with a strip of red cloth. Something in his steady gaze made Max uneasy, but he nodded respectfully before mounting his horse. The old man did not return the gesture, continuing to stare as Max rode out of town. The encounter left Max with a vague sense of disquiet that he couldn't quite shake. He had spent enough time among the Apache to recognize a medicine man when he saw one, and he suspected this might be the Nakohe that Sheriff Blackwood had mentioned. If so, his presence in town on the very day of Max's visit seemed unlikely to be coincidence. True to his word, Donovan's delivery boy arrived the next morning with a wagon laden with Max's purchases. The young man, barely 16, with a shock of red hair and freckles, helped unload the supplies but declined Max's invitation to stay for coffee. "Pa says I'm to head straight back," he explained, glancing nervously at the mine entrance. "Says this place ain't right." After the boy's departure, Max set to work. The first order of business was making the cabin habitable, patching the roof, reinforcing the door, and clearing out years of accumulated dust and debris. By sundown, he had created a space that was, if not comfortable, at least functional. The next day, he turned his attention to the mine itself. The main entrance had partially collapsed, requiring hours of careful work to shore up the timbers. Max proceeded with caution, mindful of the dangers of old mines, rotten supports, unstable rock, and the ever-present threat of pockets of deadly gas. His years as a scout had taught him to read signs others might miss, and as he ventured deeper into the main shaft, he noted the marks of previous mining operations, the picked-over veins of silver ore, abandoned tools, and evidence of hasty retreat when the mine had finally been declared worthless. For 3 days, Max explored the accessible portions of the mine, familiarizing himself with its layout and comparing what he found to the survey maps he had brought with him. The main shaft extended nearly 200 feet into the mountain before terminating in a chamber where the silver vein had played out. Several smaller tunnels branched off from this chamber, each following what had once been promising leads, but now ended in disappointment. But it was the southwestern section that interested Max most, an area marked on the maps but seemingly less thoroughly explored than the others. According to the notes on the survey, this section had been abandoned after a minor cave-in, deemed not worth the effort to clear when more accessible silver was available elsewhere. Now that the easier pickings were gone, Max wondered if this overlooked area might hold promise. On the 4th day, he began clearing the rubble that blocked access to the southwestern tunnel. It was back-breaking work, even with the tools he had purchased, and progress was slow. By the end of the day, he had managed to create an opening large enough to crawl through, though he decided to wait until morning before venturing further. That night, as Max sat before a small fire outside the cabin, he became aware of a prickling sensation at the back of his neck, the feeling of being watched. His hand moved instinctively to the Colt revolver at his side as he scanned the darkness beyond the circle of firelight. Nothing moved, but the sensation persisted. Max had survived 20 years on the frontier by trusting his instincts, and every fiber of his being told him he was not alone. "I know you're out there," he called, his voice steady. "Might as well show yourself." For a long moment, silence answered him. Then, from the shadows emerged the old Apache he had seen in town. The medicine man's face was impassive as he stepped into the light, his movements fluid despite his apparent age. "You are digging where you should not," the old man said in surprisingly good English. "The mountain does not welcome you." Max kept his hand near his gun, but did not draw. "This land is mine by law," he replied, "bought and paid for." The old man, Nakohe, Max presumed, smiled without humor. The white man's law is young. The law of the spirits is old. What sleeps in the mountain has been there since before the Apache, before all men. It should remain sleeping. Max had encountered similar warnings throughout his years on the frontier. Tales of angry spirits and sacred places meant to deter settlers from lands that native peoples considered their own. Yet something in the old man's demeanor gave him pause. There was no hostility in his voice, only a deep certainty that carried the weight of genuine belief. "What is it that sleeps in the mountain?" Max asked, his curiosity getting the better of him. Nakohe studied him for a long moment before responding. "The old ones call it Indayaji, the one who speaks through stone. In the time of my grandfather's grandfather, 300 warriors came to this mountain, seeking its power. They left as changed men, humbled before its mystery. Since then, we have kept others away." He gestured toward the mine entrance. "The white men who came before you felt its presence, but did not understand. They called it a curse. It is not a curse, but neither is it for men to disturb." With those cryptic words, the medicine man turned to leave. "Wait," Max called after him. "Is that why the vein ran dry? Because of this?" "Indayaji," Nakohe paused, looking back over his shoulder. "The silver is not gone," he said simply. "It waits where the stone speaks. But at what cost will you claim it?" Before Max could ask another question, the old man melted back into the darkness, leaving him alone with his thoughts. Max sat by the fire long into the night, turning the strange encounter over in his mind. He was not a superstitious man. He had seen too much of the world's wonders and horrors to believe in spirits and curses. Yet he could not dismiss the old man's warning entirely. There was something about this place, a quality to the silence that seemed to press against his ears when he ventured deep into the mine. And there were the dreams, vivid, disjointed visions that had plagued his sleep since his arrival. Dreams of vast, echoing chambers beneath the mountain, of lights that moved with purpose through absolute darkness, and of a voice that seemed to reverberate through stone itself. But dreams were just dreams, and Max had not come this far to be turned away by an old man's tales. Morning found Max standing before the cleared entrance to the southwestern tunnel, a lantern in one hand and his determination renewed. The passage beyond was narrower than the main shaft, requiring him to crouch as he advanced. The air grew steadily colder the deeper he went, carrying a damp, mineral smell that was different from the rest of the mine. The walls here showed fewer signs of human activity, only occasional pickaxe marks where the previous miners had tested the rock before abandoning this section. After about 50 feet, the tunnel opened into a small chamber where the cave-in had occurred. Max raised his lantern, examining the fall of rock that had blocked further progress. It appeared less severe than he had expected, suggesting that the decision to abandon this section had been made when easier silver was still available elsewhere. Now, with the rest of the mine exhausted, it seemed worth the effort to clear this obstruction and see what lay beyond. Setting down his lantern, Max began to work, carefully removing stones and debris. The work was slow and dangerous, requiring constant attention to prevent further collapse. By midday, Max had cleared enough of the rubble to reveal what appeared to be a natural fissure in the rock beyond, a narrow crack that angled downward into darkness. This matched what he had seen on the survey maps, the fault line that had caught his attention. Intrigued, he widened the opening until it was large enough to pass through, then retrieved his lantern and peered inside. The fissure descended at a steep angle for about 10 feet before leveling out into what appeared to be a natural cavern. Max hesitated, aware of the risks of entering unexplored underground spaces. The air flowing from the opening felt different, cooler and somehow charged, as if a storm were brewing underground. Every instinct warned caution, but the prospect of what might lie beyond pulled at him with irresistible force. Taking a deep breath, he eased himself into the fissure and began his descent. The natural cavern beyond the fissure took Max's breath away. His lantern illuminated a vast space, its ceiling lost in shadows above, its walls glittering with mineral deposits that caught and reflected the light in 1,000 points of brilliance. Stalactites hung like stone daggers, their tips glistening with moisture that gathered and fell in a rhythm like a slow, steady heartbeat. The floor sloped gently downward, leading to what appeared to be an even larger chamber beyond. But it was not the cavern's impressive dimensions that caused Max to freeze in his tracks. It was the unmistakable evidence of human presence. Along one wall, a series of symbols had been carved into the living rock. Strange, angular designs, unlike any writing Max had encountered in his travels. Below these symbols, arranged in a semicircle, sat 7 stone bowls, each filled with what appeared to be offerings, feathers, small carvings of animals, and objects that gleamed like polished bone. This was no random collection of items. It was a shrine of some kind, carefully maintained and recently visited. Judging by the lack of dust on the offerings, Max approached the shrine cautiously, his lantern held high. The carvings on the wall seemed to shift and change as the light moved across them, creating an illusion of movement that made him blink and look again. Beyond the arranged offerings, the cavern floor bore other signs of human activity. A fire pit ringed with stones, its ashes cold but relatively recent, and what appeared to be sleeping areas lined with woven mats. Someone, or some group, used this place regularly, coming and going via a route other than the mine shaft through which Max had entered. This explained how the Apache could access the mountain without disturbing the mine itself. As fascinating as these discoveries were, they did not answer the question that had brought Max here. Was there silver to be found? He moved deeper into the cavern, his eyes scanning the walls for signs of ore. What he saw exceeded his wildest expectations. Veins of silver, far richer than anything in the worked-out sections of the mine, ran through the rock like frozen lightning, glittering in the lantern light. The previous miners had come tantalizingly close to this chamber before the cave-in had blocked their path. Had they pressed on, the little rattler would never have been abandoned. Maxwell's heart raced as he examined the silver veins. With careful mining, this discovery could yield enough wealth to set him up comfortably for the remainder of his life. Yet even as excitement surged through him, a sense of unease tempered his elation. The shrine, the regular use of this cavern by the Apache, these complications could not be ignored. If this place was sacred to them, his mining operation would be seen as desecration. The potential for conflict was enormous. Max was no stranger to the violence that often erupted between settlers and indigenous peoples over land and resources. He had no desire to precipitate such a confrontation, yet neither was he willing to walk away from what might be his last chance at security in his advancing years. As he pondered this dilemma, his lantern light caught something else, a narrow passage leading from the main cavern deeper into the mountain. Curiosity compelled him forward into a twisting corridor where the air grew progressively warmer and carried a faint, metallic tang that reminded him oddly of blood. The passage widened suddenly into a second chamber, smaller than the first, but no less remarkable. Here, the walls were lined with a crystalline substance that seemed to glow with a faint, pulsing light, even when not directly illuminated by his lantern. At the center of the chamber stood a column of stone that rose from floor to ceiling, not a natural formation, but something carved with deliberate purpose. Its surface was covered with the same strange symbols he had seen in the outer cavern, but here they were more elaborate, spiraling around the column from base to summit. At the foot of this monument lay more offerings, more elaborate than those in the outer chamber. Gold nuggets, intricately worked silver pieces, and what appeared to be small figurines carved from a greenish stone that Max did not recognize. But it was what stood behind the column that truly captured his attention, a natural arch in the cavern wall, beyond which something glimmered with an unearthly radiance. Setting down his lantern, Max approached the arch, drawn by a curiosity he could not resist, despite the growing sense that he was trespassing in a place not meant for him. Beyond the arch lay a sight that defied Max's understanding of the natural world. A pool of water, perfectly circular and still as glass, filled a depression in the cavern floor. But this was no ordinary water. It glowed from within with a blue-white light that pulsed in a slow, regular rhythm like the beating of a giant heart. The illumination it cast revealed walls encrusted with crystals that caught and amplified the light, creating an effect like thousands of stars in a midnight sky. Max stood transfixed, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. In all his years on the frontier, he had never encountered anything remotely like this phenomenon. As he stared, the rhythmic pulsing of the light seemed to synchronize with his own heartbeat, creating a sensation of connection that was both exhilarating and terrifying. Without conscious decision, he found himself moving toward the pool, one hand outstretched as if to touch its luminous surface. A voice behind him shattered the spell. "The white man finds Indayaji, as I knew he would." Max whirled, his hand dropping instinctively to his gun. Nakohe stood in the archway, his aged face solemn in the otherworldly light. Behind him, 3 younger Apache warriors watched with expressionless faces. "What is this place?" Max demanded, struggling to keep his voice steady. "What is that?" He gestured toward the glowing pool. Nakohe stepped forward, his movements deliberate and reverent. "It is older than the Apache, older than all the peoples who have walked this land. The ancestors found it and learned to listen to its voice. It speaks of things that were and things that will be. It shows the path of harmony with all that lives." He gestured to the carved column. "Here, the wisdom it has shared is recorded for those who know how to read the signs." The old medicine man fixed Max with a penetrating gaze. "You came seeking silver, but you have found something far more precious and far more dangerous. Indayaji does not give its gifts freely. It takes something in return." Max looked from Nakohe to the pool and back again, his mind racing. "The silver veins, they're real. I saw them in the outer cavern." Nakohe nodded. "The mountain is generous with its treasures to those who approach with respect. The men who dug this mine took without asking, without offering. The mountain closed itself to them." He gestured to the shrine. "We keep the old ways. We listen before we take." One of the warriors behind him spoke rapidly in Apache, his tone urgent. Nakohe responded with a sharp gesture that silenced the younger man. "My nephew believes you should not leave this place alive," he translated, his tone matter-of-fact. "He fears you will bring others, that the sacred pool will be defiled." Max's hand tightened on his gun, but he made no move to draw. 4 against 1 in close quarters. The odds were not in his favor. Besides, something told him that violence in this place would be a terrible mistake. "I didn't come here to defile anything," Max said carefully. "I bought the mine fair and square. The silver is mine by law." Even as he spoke the words, they sounded hollow to his own ears. What claim could pieces of paper in a county office have against centuries of tradition and reverence? Nakohe seemed to read his thoughts. "The law of your people is young and changes like the wind. The law of Indayaji is old and unchanging." He stepped closer to Max, lowering his voice. "I have seen your face in the pool's visions. You are at a crossroads, Maxwell Cooper. The path you choose here will echo through many lives." The use of his full name startled Max. He had not introduced himself to the medicine man. "How do you know my name?" Nakohe smiled faintly. "Indayaji knows all who approach it. It has been waiting for you, as it waited for me in my youth, as it waited for my grandfather before me." The conversation was interrupted by a subtle change in the quality of light emanating from the pool. The pulsing quickened, and the blue-white glow deepened to a more intense azure. Nakohe turned toward it, his expression one of surprise and concern. "It speaks," he murmured, dropping to one knee beside the pool. The three warriors followed suit, their earlier hostility forgotten as they prostrated themselves before the mysterious phenomenon. Max remained standing, transfixed by the transformation taking place before his eyes. The surface of the pool, previously mirror-smooth, now rippled as if disturbed by an unfelt breeze. The ripples formed patterns, concentric circles, spirals, and shapes that seemed almost like writing, but in no language Max had ever seen. And then came the sound, a low, resonant hum that seemed to emanate not from the pool, but from the very rock beneath their feet. It grew in intensity until the entire cavern vibrated with its power, yet somehow the sound was not painful to the ears. Instead, it created a sensation of profound connection, as if every cell in Max's body were resonating in harmony with the ancient stone. The humming changed, becoming more complex, almost like speech, but without recognizable words. Max felt rather than heard meaning in the vibrations, impressions of vast age, of cycles of life and death, of knowledge accumulated over eons. Images flashed through his mind. The mountain as it had been before human eyes had ever beheld it, the coming of the first peoples, the arrival of the Apache, and finally the incursion of white settlers with their pickaxes and dynamite. He saw the mine as it had been in its heyday, bustling with activity, and then, as it would be if he proceeded with his plans, a larger operation that would eventually break through to this sacred space, exposing it to exploitation and destruction. The vision shifted, showing an alternative future, one where he worked in partnership with the Apache, extracting silver from the outer cavern with their guidance and blessing, leaving the inner chamber undisturbed. In this future, both he and the tribe prospered, and the knowledge of Indayaji was preserved for generations to come. The choice, the vision made clear, was his to make. As suddenly as it had begun, the phenomenon ceased. The pool returned to its steady, rhythmic pulsing, and the cavern fell silent once more. Nakohe rose slowly to his feet, his dark eyes fixed on Max's face. "Now you have heard its voice," he said quietly. "Few outsiders have been granted such honor." The warriors behind him remained kneeling, their expressions a mixture of awe and lingering suspicion. Max found himself struggling to process what he had experienced. Was it some form of hallucination induced by the strange light and the medicine man's suggestive words? Or had he truly communicated with something ancient and powerful beyond his comprehension? His practical, frontier-hardened mind rebelled against the latter interpretation. Yet he could not deny the profound impact of the vision. The detailed futures he had witnessed, both the destructive and the harmonious paths, contained knowledge he could not possibly possess on his own. "What happens now?" Max asked, his voice hoarse. Nakohe gestured toward the outer cavern. "That depends on what you have learned. Maxwell Cooper, the mountain has shown you two paths. Only you can choose which to follow." He stepped aside, clearing the way back through the arch. "Go. Consider what you have seen. We will await your decision." The implied threat was clear. If Max chose wrongly, he would face the opposition of the Apache, possibly violently. Yet there was also an offer of partnership, of shared prosperity, if he could set aside his exclusive claim to the mountain's treasures. Max hesitated, looking back at the glowing pool one last time. The pulsing light seemed to beckon to him, offering further revelations if he stayed. But he had seen enough for one day, more than enough to shake the foundations of his understanding of the world. Without another word, he retrieved his lantern and made his way back through the twisting passage to the outer cavern, acutely aware of the Apache warriors following at a discreet distance. The journey back to his cabin seemed to take far longer than the descent into the mountain. Each step required conscious effort, as if his body had grown unaccustomed to movement in the ordinary world. The afternoon sun nearly blinded him as he emerged from the mine entrance, its commonplace brilliance somehow less remarkable than the unearthly glow of the pool. Max sat heavily on a rock outside the cabin, his mind still reeling from his experience. The practical concerns that had driven him to purchase the mine now seemed trivial compared to the choice he faced. On one hand lay the path of conventional success, claiming the silver, perhaps bringing in partners to expand the operation, accumulating wealth at the expense of the mountain's secrets. On the other lay something far less defined, a partnership with people he barely understood, sharing in the mountain's bounty while preserving its mysteries. Neither path was without risk. The Apache might turn against him regardless of his choice, and the mining operation might fail even if he pursued it with single-minded determination. As twilight descended, Max built a small fire and prepared a simple meal, going through the motions of ordinary life while his thoughts remained deep in the mountain. He had no illusions about the difficulty of the path Nakohe had suggested. Partnership between whites and Apaches was rare in this territory, viewed with suspicion by both sides. If word spread that he was working with the tribe, he might face hostility from the people of Silver Springs and other settlements. Yet the alternative, proceeding alone and eventually exposing the sacred pool, felt increasingly wrong. A violation of something that deserved protection, regardless of one's beliefs about its nature. Max had never considered himself a particularly spiritual man, but his experience in the cavern had awakened something long dormant within him, a sense of wonder and respect for mysteries beyond human understanding. By the time the stars emerged, twinkling in the velvet darkness above, he had reached his decision. Morning found Max riding toward Silver Springs, his mind clear and his purpose fixed. His first stop was the county office, where he spent an hour in discussion with a puzzled clerk who eventually provided the documents he requested. Next came the telegraph office, where he sent messages to several contacts from his army days, men who had shown respect for native ways and might be interested in an unusual venture. His final visit was to Sheriff Blackwood, whom he found at his desk reviewing wanted posters. "Sheriff," Max began without preamble, "I need to establish a formal relationship with the Apache band that considers the mountain sacred." Blackwood set down his papers, his expression cautious. "That would be Nakohe's people. They keep to themselves mostly, trade in town occasionally." "Why do you ask?" Max explained his encounter with the medicine man, carefully omitting any mention of the glowing pool. Instead, he focused on the rich silver vein he had discovered and his desire to work it, without disrupting sites the Apache considered sacred. "This is unusual, Cooper," the sheriff said when Max had finished. "Most miners would just stake their claim and dare the Apache to interfere. You're proposing something I've never heard of, a formal partnership." Max nodded. "Times are changing, Sheriff. The old ways of taking what we want at gunpoint, they've brought nothing but bloodshed and hatred. I've seen enough of that to last several lifetimes." He leaned forward, his voice earnest. "The silver's there, enough to benefit everyone involved if we're smart about how we extract it. The Apache know the mountain better than any white man ever will. Working with them makes sense, both practically and morally." Blackwood studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I can arrange a meeting with the Indian agent, fellow named Carruthers. He's not like some I've known, seems to genuinely care about the tribes under his jurisdiction. If anyone can help formalize this arrangement, it's him." The next week passed in a flurry of activity. Maxwell met with Indian agent Carruthers, a surprisingly young man with thoughtful eyes and a reputation for fairness. Together, they drafted a document that would recognize the Apache tribe's spiritual claim to portions of the mountain, while confirming Max's legal right to mine silver from specified areas. The arrangement was unprecedented in the territory, a formal acknowledgement of dual stewardship that respected both legal ownership and ancient tradition. Carruthers warned that higher authorities might object, but promised to advocate for the agreement. Meanwhile, Max received responses to his telegrams, cautiously interested inquiries from former colleagues who had the capital and expertise to help develop the mine responsibly. When all was in readiness, a meeting was arranged at the Little Rattler. Nakohe and 3 tribal elders would represent the Apache. Sheriff Blackwood and Agent Carruthers would witness the agreement as representatives of civil authority. The day of the meeting dawned clear and cool, a perfect Arizona autumn morning. Max spent the early hours preparing the cabin, setting up a rough table outside where the documents could be reviewed and signed. By mid-morning, riders appeared on the trail from Silver Springs, Blackwood and Carruthers, punctual as expected. The Apache delegation arrived from the opposite direction an hour later, materializing from the scrubland with the sudden appearance that had unnerved so many settlers over the years. Nakohe led the group, his face impassive but his eyes alert as he surveyed the gathering. The formal proceedings began with Agent Carruthers explaining the terms of the agreement in both English and Apache, with Nakohe occasionally correcting his translation. The document recognized the southwestern section of the mountain as sacred ground, accessible only to tribal members. The main shaft and northern sections of the mine were confirmed as Maxwell's property, to be worked in consultation with tribal representatives to ensure minimal disturbance to the mountain as a whole. Profits from the operation would be shared, with a percentage going to the tribe in recognition of their spiritual stewardship. When the terms had been fully explained, Nakohe stepped forward. "Before marks are made on paper," he said in his clear English, "the white man Cooper must understand what this means. The agreement will bind not just him, but all who follow him. The sacred places must remain undisturbed for all time. Does he accept this burden?" All eyes turned to Max, who met the medicine man's gaze without wavering. "I do," he replied simply, "and I will ensure that those who come after me understand and respect this agreement." Nakohe nodded, seemingly satisfied. "Then we will show our acceptance in the old way, before we make marks on your paper." At a gesture from the medicine man, one of the elders produced a small clay pot and a brush made from yucca fibers. With deliberate movements, he mixed a dark pigment with water from a skin. Nakohe dipped his thumb into the mixture and pressed it to the document, leaving a perfect impression. The other elders followed suit. Then Nakohe extended the pot to Max. "Your thumb sign beside ours, older than writing, binding in the eyes of the ancestors." Max did as requested, pressing his thumb into the mixture and then onto the paper beside the Apache marks. Sheriff Blackwood and Agent Carruthers added their signatures as witnesses, and the formal part of the ceremony was complete. What followed was unexpected. Nakohe invited all present to accompany the Apache delegation to the entrance of the sacred cavern. "You have respected our ways," he explained to Max. "Now you will see the proper manner of entering the domain of Indayaji." The group proceeded into the mine, following the path Max had cleared to the southwestern tunnel. At the entrance to the natural fissure, the Apache stopped and began a solemn ceremony, burning sage and cedar, chanting in low voices, and making offerings of cornmeal and tobacco. Only when these rituals were complete did Nakohe lead them through the fissure into the outer cavern. The reactions of Blackwood and Carruthers to the vast, glittering space were much like Max's own had been, awe mingled with disbelief at the richness of the untouched silver veins. But they were not invited further, not shown the inner chamber with its mysterious pool. That privilege was reserved for later, after the white officials had departed, and Max remained alone with Nakohe and the elders. "You have chosen wisely," the medicine man told him as they stood before the glowing pool. "Few of your people would have seen beyond their own desire for wealth." Max watched the pulsing light, feeling again the strange connection he had experienced during his first visit. "It wasn't entirely selfless," he admitted. "The silver in the outer cavern is enough to make this venture profitable. I don't need what lies deeper." Nakohe smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. "The wisest choices often serve both self and others. Indayaji approves. It will guide your steps in the days to come, as it has guided mine." He placed a gnarled hand on Max's shoulder. "You are not Apache. But you have become a guardian of Indeaji, the first of your kind, perhaps not the last. In the months that followed, the little rattler was transformed. Maxwell's former army colleagues arrived with capital and expertise, establishing a small but efficient operation focused on extracting silver from the approved sections of the mine. True to his word, Max ensured that all who worked the claim understood and respected the boundaries established in the agreement with the Apache. Under Nakohe's guidance, appropriate ceremonies were conducted before each new phase of mining, and a portion of the profits was faithfully set aside for the tribe. The arrangement drew curious visitors from as far away as Washington, D.C., officials who came to observe this unprecedented cooperation between white miners and Apache. Some dismissed it as foolishness or weakness on Max's part, but others recognized the wisdom in his approach. The little rattler prospered without the violence and conflict that had characterized so many mining operations in Apache territory. And if some visitors noticed the unusual respect with which both Max and the Apache treated the southwestern section of the mountain, few asked questions. Those who did received only enigmatic smiles and references to local traditions. For Maxwell Cooper, the years that followed brought a prosperity he had never imagined possible. The silver from the little rattler made him a wealthy man by frontier standards. Though his simple lifestyle changed little, he expanded the cabin into a comfortable home but maintained its unpretentious character. He became a respected figure in Silver Springs, known for fair dealing and generosity toward those in need. But his greatest satisfaction came from the knowledge that he had found a way to balance progress with preservation, profit with respect. Under his stewardship, the secret of Indeaji remained safe, accessible only to those whom Nakohe deemed worthy of initiation into its mysteries. Occasionally, on nights when the moon was dark and the stars blazed in the desert sky, Max would venture into the inner chamber alone. There, beside the glowing pool, he would sit in contemplation, listening to the ancient voice that spoke through stone and water. And sometimes, in the pulsing light, he would glimpse visions of futures yet to unfold, paths that wound through joy and sorrow, prosperity and hardship, always returning to the timeless mystery at the heart of the mountain. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.